Hi class, and welcome back to another asynchronous lecture for social psychology. Today we're going to be discussing chapter 3, the self. Before we hop right in, let's go over a couple quick announcements. I want you guys to just remember to keep up with the material. Since there are no exams, the quizzes are going to stand in place of that. So make sure you are reading, you are watching these videos, and you are paying attention to what you need to get a good grade on that. Additionally, there are these theory and practice papers that will be coming up soon. The first one is going to be due September 10th for those of you on the Thursday version of the class, and for September 15th for those of you on the Tuesday version. It's not up as of the time that I'm probably uploading this video, but it should be up by the end of the weekend, which may have already passed by the time you see this video. Some other things to note, my office hours, right? Just remember those are available by appointment or Tuesday and Thursday from 11:30 to 12:30 on Zoom. So if you do have any questions, you can also email me or stop by those virtual office hours. Now let's talk about what we're going to be going over today. Well, the self is made up of a lot of different aspects. So first of all, we're just going to talk about the basics, right? What is the self? What does it mean to have a self? Then we'll talk about self-knowledge, how we learn about ourselves. We'll talk about how we evaluate ourselves with self-evaluation. Not only can we think about self in terms of who we are, we also have to remember that we are people in a greater context with others around us. And we have to we create impressions on other people, and we have to manage how we create those impressions. So we'll talk about impression management. We'll also talk about self-esteem and a couple other things related to that. But to begin this part of the class, we are just going to start off with the basics and talk about what is the self. And this is a weird question, right? What does it mean to have a self, or what does it mean to be you, right? And we can talk about a lot of different things there, but how we can think about this is more of like a self-schema, if you've heard the word schemas before. And what we mean by that is that we have different ways to think about ourselves. And the most common way we think about ourselves is the idea of an individual self. And an individual self is a beliefs about our unique personality traits, or personal traits, whether they be personality or other, our abilities, our preferences, our tastes, our talents, things like that, right? What is it that makes you a unique individual, or you different than others? We can also talk about other types of the self. We can talk about the relational self, beliefs about our identities in specific relationships. We know, right, we are social creatures. We are not the only people or person, you might say, in the world. And we can talk about how we relate to others versus how we are, right, different or individual. Beyond the relational self, though, we can think even broader. We can talk about the collective self and beliefs about our identities as members of social groups to which we belong. Now, this is kind of similar to the relational self, and you might get it confused in the sense it's like, well, if we have other people around, don't we belong? Well, what we mean by that is, right, I, for instance, have a relational self, right, in the fact that I am married and have a spouse. I have, right, a father. I have a mother, which means I'm a son to them. And those are kind of relationships we might talk about. And while I have a relationship with Stetson University in the fact that they pay me, I see myself more as, right, a professor or a Stetson University person. And that is going to be what we're talking about there. So I still have this from my old university, Texas A&M, which, right, had a very strong collective self where Aggies were, as they called themselves, A&M Agricultural Mechanical Aggies. These Aggies were very focused on the fact that they were all part of the same group. And the cool thing about all three of these different individual or relational and collective selves, or right, these three selves, is that they actually have a lot of important functions. If we think about what schemas do, as I mentioned, these influence how we think, how we act, how we behave all the time. You might have heard of a self-reference effect, the fact that we actually remember information better when it's related to who we are, to ourselves, So think about it this way. What date is easier to remember? Somebody who's, somebody else's birthday who has the same birthday as you, or somebody who doesn't have the same birthday as you? Well, when we can relate that information to ourselves, right? It's like, oh, we share the same birthday. That's going to be easier to remember. So that influences how we think. Are people like us? Are people related in the sense, it's if that information is related to us? But beyond that, you all have probably heard of the cocktail party effect, or if you haven't, you've probably experienced it. And the cocktail party effect is the idea that if you were at a cocktail party or in a classroom before class started and everybody was chatting, if somebody called your name out, you would be able to immediately recognize that over everything else. If you have a name like Kyle and you hear the words smile, mile, things like that, you might also accidentally jump up and kind of think that's what you meant to, think that's what you heard. And that actually influences, how we process our information. So we are constantly looking out for our own names and stuff related to us. So it's important to recognize that the self is made up of many different things, and these are all parts to what make us who we are. And when we think about the self, well, we have to talk about the development of the self. So when does the self develop? Do we come out of the womb, with a sense of self? Does my 1-month-old baby have a sense of self? Well, one way we can study this are through mirror studies, because to know if we have a sense of self, we've got to be able to test it somehow. And what mirror studies do allow us to have some creature, a human or something else, look into a mirror and be able to tell if that is a different creature in the mirror or if it's the same creature. And if you're able to recognize that that's you in the mirror, we would say that that's a pretty good judge of whether you have a sense of self. You can look at something and go, hey, that's me, right? As my wife hates, oftentimes when she will pull out a mirror, I will look at it and I'll go, it's a really good looking portrait of whoever's in there, right? That would be me, right? One, being a little bit of a goon to say something like that, but two, if I truly believe that, I wouldn't have developed a sense of self, right? I'd be like, oh, there's somebody in there that's not me. So how can we do this? Well, one way we can do this is we can just take a pen or a marker, and what we can do is for some people, right, we'll say kids in this instance, we can place just a little mark on their forehead that they can see, right? So I have this little button here, so it might be clearer, right? If I were to place a button right here on my forehead, and then I looked in a mirror, I would probably go, what's that on my head? But what if, right, we pretended to put a dot on somebody's forehead, right, an empty marker, and we placed it there, and then we showed them the mirror. And they look at it and they go, nothing, okay. And that gets around the idea that somebody might, kind of scratch after having this put on them. But what you see is that for creatures, humans, other types of animals that don't have a sense of self, they will look at that other creature, quote unquote, in the mirror with the dot on their forehead, and they'll try to write, what's on your forehead, buddy? Not what's on my forehead. And that is a pretty good judge of the sense of self. It's one way we can get around this, right? When we talk about issues with survey designs and things like this, right? My daughter can't tell me if she has a sense of self, but we can show ways like this to see that. What we do know is that, no, my daughter does not have a sense of self. Idiot. She's too stupid to have a sense of self. No. The sense of self comes online between about 18 to 24 months. So between 1.5 years old and 2 years old is when you're able to start recognizing you are you. And as I've kind of hinted at, right, we can ask if animals have a sense of self. Well, we know certain animals have a sense of self. Non-human primates, for instance, have a sense of self, and we're talking great apes, right? So chimps and orangutans, when they come up to this mirror study, will immediately look at their own forehead, especially if they've got that little mark there and go, so I see myself in the mirror. But lesser apes like gibbons, they do not. It's mostly these great apes, but we do have a few other exceptions. So a couple other exceptions include dolphins. Dolphins have a sense of self. Elephants develop a sense of self as well. we know that big cats don't develop a sense of self, but what does is we found evidence within just two magpies, right? Not species of magpie, two magpies have a sense of self. I don't believe they've done this on crows, or if so, I'm not sure, but I know crows are very, very smart, and they might have a sense of self. However, at the time of this video, I'm not really sure of that. I realize the nice thing about recording these virtually is the fact that I can go check. The answer is no, crows do not have a sense of self. Only magpies, which are closely related to crows. Why? Well, think about what types of animals these are. And just why would they have a sense of self over other animals? Keep that in mind. So moving on from that, though, the self, we can break it down into an individual self, into a relational self, into a collective self, right? But the question comes down to, are we always the same, right? Back in the day, when we used to actually be able to go outside, right? Would you say that you were the same when you were out, right, partying with your friends as you are at the dinner table with your parents? Are you the same when you are going to cheer for your favorite team versus when you come to a class? Probably not. If you are, that's really impressive. But what can we talk about with this, and why does this happen? Why is it that we're different sometimes? Why is it that I might be some way with some friends and another way with another friends? Well, part of that is because we have what we call a working self-concept, right? Our self-schemas, right, are brought to mind for a particular concept, whether that be who I am in class, who I am in front of my parents, who I am when I'm out on the dance floor. Those are very different. And how I like to think of them is almost like, if anybody was like me, probably in middle school, you had different notebooks for different classes. So when you think of it that way, right, you don't take every single notebook to every class, or if you didn't have to, you probably didn't. But what we do is we actually activate the parts of ourselves that would be most useful in a given situation. We're talking about, right, the person in the situation here. We know that we have a wide variety of feelings, thoughts, behaviors, emotions, and just because I can get angry sometimes does not mean I am an angry person. Just because I get happy sometimes does not mean I can't ever get angry, right, or reverse. So recognizing that part of our self-concept is very relevant on the situation in which we are in. But within the working self-concept, there's a couple things that I do want to talk about, right? We can think about what might impact what gets activated with the working self, right? So we know, right, what situation and what kind of people we're with, but we can also talk about what makes us distinct. So we call this the distinctiveness hypothesis, and how we identify what makes us unique in a given context. And we like to highlight that part of the self, right? If I asked you all on day one, right, hi, my name's Kyle, here's who I am, can you tell me a little about yourselves? Tell me what university you go to. One, I know what university you go to because we're there, but if I asked you, do you guys sleep in a bed at night? That's something most people do, and things like that aren't really relevantly useful to talk about. One of the ways that I like to think about this is if you ever hear somebody kind of introduce themselves and say, I don't like drama, think about why they would be doing that. I don't like drama. I mean, not a lot of drama, especially if it's involving my life. But what we can think about with something like that is the fact that, right, they're trying to be distinctive and unique. So maybe they're around people who cause a lot of drama. And so we talk about what makes us unique and individual. So if you think about, right, Jess here from New Girl, or the actress who plays her is blanking. I'm blanking on that. She is unique in this scenario in a pretty obvious way. Right? She's, right, the woman in the show, or she's the girl with the three other main characters being male. What you see here is that one thing you might introduce yourself as, if you're like, oh, right, what do I'm the girl character on that show. Versus in a different situation in which there are, right, multiple women and it's not just, right, one, we might highlight something else that's unique about us, right? I'm 5'5" compared to, right, this taller individual here, who is clearly not. I am also not 5'5" though. Zooey Deschanel. Oh my goodness, I forgot. So with the distinctiveness hypothesis, we can look at one study, which you don't really need to know the name of. It's just kind of something I like to bring up here, is that when asking sixth graders from different schools to spend about 7 minutes each describing themselves on a piece of paper, we looked at what things they talked about. So on average, children wrote about 12 statements, which referred to their hobbies, their attitudes, their friends, their school activities, who they are. But some of the things that they varied on were three different factors. So what they looked at were students whose ages were either 6 months greater than or less than the average of the class. So maybe somebody who's a year ahead or has fallen behind and is still in this grade. They also looked at places of birth. So were these students born in the U.S. or outside the U.S.? And then the gender. So were they the majority gender in the class or the non-majority gender in the class? And so these are three things that people might be very similar on or very different, right? Most students in the United States are born in the United States. Most students in any given grade are about the age of their peers. With gender, right, most classes are about equal gender, but sometimes that's very heavily skewed one way or another. And so when we look at what students say regarding these self-definitions and self-statements, we see that, right, students generally talk maybe about their age, but more so when they are unique, right? So when these are this is unusual, they often bring it up. In place of birth, right? If you are an American in an American classroom, you're probably not going to write, I'm an American. But if that is something unique to you, you're much more likely to talk about it. And similarly with gender, we see the same thing. So the key here is that this was done in the U.S., and we'll talk about why that's important here in a second. But what is central to the identity is what makes us distinct, especially in a Western, right, culture like the U.S. Do we think we would see this outside of the U.S.? Well, if you've read the book already, you should know that it might not be the case. And what we're talking about here is the difference between independent and interdependent cultures. And I'm just going to go ahead and throw this whole chart up here, but let's start talking about independent cultures first. So independent cultures are cultures in which the self is distinct from others. It is an independent concept. What the independent cultures tend to focus on, right, is the fact that we are acting on our own, we are individualistic, we are each distinct in certain ways. We maybe prefer egalitarianism and achievement-based status. Well, what do we mean by that? In independent cultures, people like to believe that everyone is equal and given the same rights as others, and that what we achieve in our lives is based solely on what we are able to do, on our independence and our ability to, right, do what we can, given the fact that we are all equal. Another thing about an independent culture is that oftentimes individuals believe rules about behavior should apply to everyone. So every single person should do the same thing, which we can talk about why that's maybe good or bad a little in class. But the interdependent cultures that we can talk about, on the other hand, is more focused on this idea that the self is linked to others. So we are not just distinct from other people, although we are. And in America and other, what we would say, independent cultures, we see this a lot, that we are distinct. But in interdependent, often Eastern Asian countries, South America, Central America, we see that the self is considered linked to others more tightly. While yes, I am a son and my dad, right, and mom are people who raised me, that's not what comes to mind when I think of who I am. But in independent or interdependent cultures, we see that more, right, that people are talking about this linkage to others, and talking about, instead of the importance of acting on one's own, the importance of collective action, that we are working as a group, right? We're all in this together, and I'm not going to sing it, but that idea here. Well, independent cultures, right, look at things like individual distinctiveness. Interdependents are looking at group cohesion and harmony. So how is it that those around me are feeling? Am I feeling integrated in the group? Are we feeling we are all one? We also see that instead of egalitarianism and achievement-based status, these individuals tend to prefer hierarchy in interdependent cultures and social group-based status, right? So for instance, in Japan, which tends to be a more interdependent culture, we see the elderly are considered in a higher social status, maybe more than America, right? Where we are supposed to respect our elders, but in Japan, it is seen as a much more strong kind of hierarchy-based thing. Interestingly, the last thing we can talk about here is that the idea that rules about behavior should consider the context and the group concerns, right? Is there a valid reason that maybe somebody's behavior should be different, right? Is it a contextual factor? Is the group concerned, or is this, right, something that the group needs to be aware of? So all of these things really seem like they matter a great deal. And as we talk about, culture really matters in terms of, right, it's one of these things that we grow up in. And, right, oftentimes we can't see it until we see what other cultures do. For instance, in the Northeast Ohio, right across the border is Pennsylvania. And one of the cultural distinctive things that they do is they say yins, if you've ever heard of this, Y-I-N-Z. And I always like this example because it's not interdependent or dependent, but the idea that this culture that's like 50 miles away from me says, what are yins doing? And I'm like, excuse me? What the hell does that mean? Well, the point being is that, right, these cultural differences are very large, right? The United States versus Japan versus other countries, but it's also within, right, these smaller groups. And so what we can talk about here, as I put up the rest of this, right, is that, again, the self being distinct from others, we see this person over here is again not related to these other people, right? Well, is related, but isn't seeing them as part of themselves. Whereas over here, maybe that's a little different. Right, so we can talk about how independent cultures oftentimes focus on how they enjoy being unique and different from other people, whereas interdependent cultures maybe are focused on how happiness depends on the happiness of those around them, right? So maybe it's that group cohesion. However, it's not just these great large cultural differences across countries as we talk about. We see these differences within cultures. For instance, men typically have higher scores on independent, right, kind of measures, whereas women tend to have higher scores on interdependent measures. Like all things, that does not mean women are just whole and by and large more interdependent and men are whole and by and large more independent. These are general trends. Not only that, but another one we can see is that for individuals high in socioeconomic status, those who have a lot of power, whether that be money, powerful jobs, etc., they tend to fall into more independent norms and cultural what have yous. Whereas those low in socioeconomic status, right, maybe those with less money, less power, tend to fall into a more interdependent style of culture. Now, given all that, we can talk about some differences that we can see across cultures. So in a study by Kim and Marcus back right about the year 2000, what these individuals did was have participants complete a study, and at the end of the study, what they were actually measuring, their dependent measure, was what participants chose, right? This behavioral measure for how they chose a reward for a study. And they were going to earn or, get to earn a pen. However, what they looked at that was most interesting was what color. pen individuals chose. And how they did this was they set it up to have 4 of the same color pen. I only happen to have 3 here, versus 1 of a different color pen. Now, this may not be the best measure, right? As we talked about operational definitions, that we have to find some way to determine kind of individualistic versus collectivistic. But what they did was they asked people from different cultures, both Americans and East Asians, to pick whatever pen they wanted. What they found was that for Americans, 74% would pick this unique color, in my case, this black pen. And then in Eastern Asians, 76% would pick the common color. So the one of these 3 right here. That's really, really interesting, right? Because if we think about this, if there's 5 pens, you should have a 20% chance that you choose the unique pen. And we would expect, right, the East Asians about 80% of the time, we'd expect anybody about 80% of the time to choose a black pen if we just picked randomly. But we know that that's not always the way it's worked, and that's not how people feel. So this is, again, even just kind of in choosing what color pen you're going to use, Eastern Asians or interdependent individuals may choose kind of to go with the group and be less independent or more focused on what the group is doing. Now, again, when I say less independent, I think as Americans, we often think that's a bad thing. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's just something unique and worth mentioning. Now, we can also talk about some 20 statement studies, which we will do this activity in class, so this may not make too much sense to you, but when we talk about 20 statement studies, we can look at the differences between North American and Chinese students. Again, so a very independent culture versus a very interdependent culture. In North America, these individuals use more trait descriptions to describe who they are, where Chinese individuals tend to use more group affiliations. So again, going back to this, that fits along with our idea of independent versus interdependent. However, what if we look at kind of a mixed bag here? Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is currently going through a lot, and that is beside the point, but what this was done back in the 1990s, Hong Kong was considered a semi-independent zone in China, and what they did was they recognized that a lot of these individuals, I should say Hong Kong was heavily influenced by the West in more independent cultures because it was an open zone of economics. Anybody who knows this better than me can go ahead and call me out on this. I think I turned the comments off, so just email me a rant. But the idea here is that these individuals, maybe we can actually change what people think about their culture or what kind of or prime what culture they have. And so what they did was they gave students a paper in English or Chinese and said, write these 20 statements. And again, the instructions were just in English or Chinese. That was our only difference. And what you see is that when these Hong Kong students are given this paper in English, they write more personal traits, whereas when it's given in Chinese, we again see more group affiliation. Going back to this idea that our self-schema, we take certain parts of who we are at certain times. And it's not necessarily just the fact that, hey, I came from an interdependent culture, therefore I'm going to choose the pen that is most common, or vice versa. So that is what we can talk about with the basics of self, but let's talk about self-knowledge. How do we learn about who we are? So when we think about how we learn about who we are, that's a really good question. I think a lot of people don't actually spend the time doing that, but the one way we can do so that I think is most common, is we can just look inward, We can look inward to see what we find, who we are. Another way we can figure this out is by just observing our own behaviors. So what kind of behaviors do we choose to do? And maybe that tells us a little about who we are. The other way, of course, is we can ask other people to tell us how they perceive us. And that might give us a better understanding of who we are. So starting with the first one, looking inward, this is the idea of introspection. Introspection, looking inward to examine our own thoughts, feelings, and motives. Intro, or internal. Inspection, spectacles, spectate, eyes, viewing, looking inward. this is that insider information that we can get. The cool thing about this is that we can do this at any given time. We can look and say, why am I feeling the way I am? But when we think about how useful this process is, we don't actually use it all that often. And high school juniors, in one study, Moore et al., found that maybe this is about 3 times a day for high school juniors. And remember, these are kind of people who are going to be probably very self-conscious and at a point where who they are really matters. The reasons, though, that we may do these things may be hidden or incorrect, right? We may not know the reasons. We might focus our attention on non-optimal criteria or reasons that we aren't exactly sure of. So, right, when we can think about this, we may not know why, right, for what reasons that, right, we choose the person we choose to marry. But what if I got hung up on a reason that maybe actually isn't that big of a deal? And then I thought about it and it kind of threw me off, right? What if you are focused too much on, right, well, what's important to me? And you say grades. Grades are the only thing that's important to me. Hopefully there's other things that are important, but if you focus too much on certain things, one, you might not be looking hard enough to see all the things that matter, and 2, you might be focused on things that really aren't the optimal things you should be looking at. We know, though, that there are limits to this kind of knowledge, right? Good question. Do we know why we like things? I mean, we have reasons we like things. Why do I like psychology? Why do you like psychology? Hopefully none of you said, I don't, to me. If you did, why don't you? But what about something like, should we think about why we like a romantic partner? Would this be a useful thing? Like most things in social psychology, and somewhat, but not always, it's probably good to know, right, the basics. It's like, oh, so why'd you marry this person? Oh, I don't know. That's not a good answer, right? You should know, right, they're kind, they compliment me, they're right, compliment meaning like they're my other half, they're wonderful people, etc. But a study by, Wilson and Kraft looked at students involved in dating relationships who attended 4 weekly sessions throughout this study. And either they introspected about why they felt the way they did about their relationship, or they introspected about an unrelated topic. As predicted, at week 1, people who introspected about the reasons why they're in a relationship brought to mind thoughts that were inconsistent with their initial feelings about the relationships and actually changed their attitudes in the direction of some of those reasons. That attitude change persisted throughout the rest of the study. It didn't necessarily increase, but that kind of reversal in attitude did happen. What they saw was that people in the control condition, however, showed an increasing amount of attitude change after each session, such that by the end of the study, they had changed as much as people in the reasons condition, or reasons why condition, why they like their partner. So what you see is that either thinking about the reasons or answering detailed questions about a relationship can actually affect the way we understand our relationship and leads to attitude change. And so if we think too hard about something, we might come to a different answer, maybe than what our gut says, right? You probably have all experienced something like this where you've overthought a question on an exam and came with the wrong answer. This maybe suggests we can do so with a partner, right? Maybe you have this really great partner with you and then you overthink it and, right, make a decision to break up. So we can see things like this have a big effect, right? And it may be something more than, right, we might first think, I like this example here, right, oh yeah, my partner's great, there's some minor issues, but that's fine. But then if you start thinking about the reasons and you say, I really hate that I always get the green text because I have an iPhone and they have a Samsung. Well, with that, you might end up running into issues where you end up resenting somebody over this tiny reason that doesn't matter. But with this kind of knowledge from looking inward, right, we can do some good things, but not necessarily is it the best way to do these things, right? But we maybe want to ease up on the gas and going too hard on that. My wife's lunch is done. I apologize for that. So, can we trigger introspection or self-awareness? Well, we know we do it, but we can. How do we think we can do that? Well, we can use a mirror, we can use a video of ourselves, right? I refuse to watch these videos of myself because I don't want to, have that perception of me or do that level of introspection about who I am, but I could if I wanted to. And what we call this is the self-awareness theory. So when we focus on ourselves, what we tend to do is we evaluate and compare our behaviors to our internal standards and values. Well, this is good, right? So if I walk in front of a mirror, or I decide to watch one of these videos, I might look at myself and go, okay, well, I look okay, maybe I'm up to the standards of how I like to dress, maybe I sound hopefully proficient in what I'm talking about, right? And I'm looking at my standards for who I am. And is that guy who I'm seeing, right, am I living up to those? Well, what are some consequences of doing this? Well, we can be aware of disparities, right? If I look at myself and go, oh, my hair was so bad today. How am I getting away with this? What we can also do is change behavior, right? We can see that and we can go, oh, I don't like that. I'm gonna change behavior. We can also be dissonant to it, right? We can ignore it. We can hide it. We can pretend it doesn't exist. We can recognize that maybe who we are in that moment and who we want to be is not exactly the same, and we can figure out a way to either bring those closer together or, again, drop the subject. This can also trigger a change in mood states, right? If you look at yourself and you feel really good, you're going to feel good. If you look at yourself and feel really bad, you're going to feel bad, right? And this is all just based on appearance. But imagine you kind of walk by and you're like, I'm not sure, I'm kind of down today. And you look and you just look really tired, right? You might just be like, do I always look like this? Is that who I am? Am I just always tired? And that can, right, cause you to think certain ways and change your behavior patterns as well. We can also talk about how this connects to escaping who we are, right? We can maybe again think about how that's, right, that guy isn't who I am. That person is not who I am, even though that's who you are because that's what you're doing. And that might be a way that introspection, right, that we see what we're doing and we decide, this isn't who I want to be. I'm going to, right, go back and change my behavior. But with the self-awareness theory, this is a great little chart, right? The first thing that happens is we find some way to become self-aware, whether that's a mirror or some kind of what we call a self-focusing cue in the environment. So this creates a state of awareness, and we become aware about ourselves, and we think about who we are. At that point, we kind of look and we compare maybe our behaviors or our thoughts or how we are to, right, our internal standards or our expectations for ourselves. If they match, great, cool, right? Look in the mirror. I think I look good. I seem to look good. I'm good to go. If no, well, now we have a problem, right? So I have an issue where who I see and who I'm thinking about and who I am is not the same. Well, one thing we can do is we can change our behavior, right? Oh, my hair's messed up. Let me go ahead and fix it. Or we can, right, run from our behavior. We can feel terrible. We can flee from a state of self-awareness as quickly as possible. We can try to be like, I don't want to think about that anyways. Get my mind on something else. I don't want to think about who I am. I don't want to think about that self-knowledge. Now, we know that this is going to be really useful in a lot of situations, right? We know that actually thinking about that self-awareness, right? Think about the cameras when you do a self-checkout. That actually makes us follow our morals, right? It gives us a check on that. So we see less cheating on exams if people are given the chance to kind of view themselves either during or right before an exam. We see less people stealing from, restaurants, from stores that have these kind of checkout monitors. And so we do know this can be very, very useful as well. But like most tools in our toolbox of understanding who we are, there are times to use them and maybe times to not. So that is how we can learn from introspection, but we can also gain self-knowledge from our own behaviors. And when is this more likely to happen, right? When is it that we're going to look at our behaviors over maybe what we feel or what we think? Well, sometimes we're not certain, or we have ambiguous attitudes or feelings. How did you like that movie, right? And you can be like, well, I'm not really sure how I like that movie. And maybe we think back to what we did, right? Not only that, but we want to talk about behaviors that are freely chosen, right? Well, did you like that movie? Well, I thought I was going to, and I chose to go see that movie, so I must have had some interest in that movie. And those are things that we can help us to see who we are. So imagine you ask yourself, right, are you somebody who eats very healthy? Well, we might think about our behaviors. You might say, I like to think I'm somebody who eats very healthy, but let me think about, right, do I? What kind of knowledge do I have about my eating behaviors? So maybe you think back to all those times that you ate a bunch of sweets. Well, that's going to help you remember or kind of understand who you are, right? Well, I did eat a ton of sweets, so maybe who I am is somebody who doesn't eat very healthy. But additionally, you can also think about, right, the times you go to the gym. And if you're, right, freely choosing to go to the gym 2 days a week, you can say, well, I must be some kind of healthy, right? And that's going to help us understand who we are. While we talked about the self-awareness theory, right, and being aware of who we are, here we're talking about what we call the self-perception theory. When our attitudes and feelings we're uncertain of that, what we do is we perceive what we do. Rather than being aware that we are here, we are perceiving the things we do. And we observe our behavior in the situation that occurs. Right? So one way to think about this is, do you watch sports because you like them, or do you like sports because it's what you watch on TV? What I've learned is one thing I tend to like to do is I like to watch UFC fights. However, I don't follow the schedule. I don't right, go somewhere to watch these. But if I find a link online to watch these, I tend to sit down and watch these fights. So do I like UFC because, right, do I watch UFC because I like it? Or is it just something that's on and I'm like, I'm going to throw it on for a little bit? Well, this comes down to a determination of how our attitudes work, right? And so while traditional views of attitudes suggest that our attitudes determine our behaviors, right? I like UFC, so I'm going to watch it. That's not always the case. Sometimes our behavior change, right? Sometimes I watch UFC and then I'm like, I guess I do like it. And here they use the example of politicians. If you have a negative attitude towards politicians and you don't like it, negative attitude towards liberal politicians, right? If I have that strong attitude in my head, that makes sense, right? I have a firm attitude already, so I'm going to do that behavior. But when we're not sure, we might look inwards. Right? Now that I think about it, I only vote for conservatives. Right? Maybe this person didn't do much introspection or do much self-perception. And now they've kind of determined their attitude based on what they do. So with this idea of self-knowledge from our behavior, right, this is oftentimes mostly when we are not exactly sure, right? When our attitudes towards something are uncertain. Now, if I like, right, video games, which I hope that's pretty apparent, that's a strong attitude I have, right? My attitude, I like video games, I'm going to play video games. It's not like I'm like, I'm not really sure, right? We know some of these things, but we don't know everything about ourselves, right? That's why we have this idea of self-knowledge. Well, we can also talk about self-knowledge in our behaviors in our relation to our self-perception, right, who we think we are, and how motivated we are to do something, right? So think of something you really, really enjoy doing, just because you enjoy doing it, right? For me, maybe that's video games or reading about social psychology for me, nerd. But at some point, you may have thought to yourself, right, wouldn't it be awesome if I didn't have to find a job and I could just do this one thing, right? Like, play video games all day. Well, I'm halfway there. I just teach instead of play video games, but it looks like we're moving towards that Twitch live stream any day now. The point of that, though, is according to self-perception and motivation, we might have two different motivations for something. We might have intrinsic motivation, a desire to engage in activity because we enjoy it, right? I like playing video games because I like playing video games. But we might have extrinsic motivations, right? A desire to engage in activity because of external rewards, right? I don't like to clean my car, but I like a clean car. this is going to be a very big difference, right? We might really like to learn in class, and that is something we do because we enjoy it. But we also might study for exams because we know that external reward of getting an A or a good grade is very important, right? If I didn't get paid for this job, right, I enjoy teaching, I love teaching, but there is also part of me that needs to get an external reward in order for this to be worth it for me. And so when we think about intrinsic motivations, right, if we really, really like school and do really well with that, that might be something that we consider an intrinsic motivation. However, if we don't, we can also think that that's maybe an extrinsic motivation. We're just focused on getting good grades instead of learning. But another example is an extrinsic motivation might be playing piano. I played piano as a kid. Eventually, I kind of lost my interest in it, but I continued to play because my parents told me to continue to play. The external reward or the avoiding of an external punishment is what continued to have me play video games. So again, play piano. But with the extrinsic motivation, we're talking about being motivated, playing soccer maybe because you want to be the best or you want to win, versus playing for its own sake, an intrinsic motivation, it's worth its own reward. So how can we show this, and what happens when we have people who are going to do something that's maybe intrinsic or extrinsic, and do the shift over time, as I said mine kind of did regarding piano? Well, one thing we know is that if I'm somebody who loves to play video games and I start to do it for a living, I might actually lose how much I enjoy it. And so in a nursery school study looking at nursery students, what they did was they had students who showed an interest in drawing a picture. They looked for some intrinsic motivation for this, right? Hey, what are you guys doing? Oh, we're drawing pictures. And so these students, all the students in the study would draw a picture with these kind of what they called attractive marker pens. So pens that to a kid were probably really cool. I miss that age when it used to be that everything was super cool and it was just like, yeah, this pen smells like grape, quote unquote. But hey, you know what? Let the kids enjoy it. So then they had individuals in three conditions, or these kids in three conditions. In one condition, the students were told that they were going to get a good player award. Before they were able to use these marker pens, the children in this condition were told that if you draw some pictures for us, you're going to go ahead and get this fancy marker here. Oh boy, how wonderful. In another condition, they were told, hey, do you want to draw some pictures for us? Why don't you just draw some pictures for us? And at the end, they were given a fancy marker. In the third condition, they were not told about the award, as in the second condition, and they didn't receive one afterwards. Now, these were taken in different classrooms, so it's not like some students are seeing their friends get pens and others not. But what they did was a few weeks later, the marker pens ended up showing up in the nursery again, and they were available to be used during the free play time that students had. And what they did was they had observers record how long each child played with the pens based on what condition they were in. What you see, and what you can think here is, well, how much did children use these markers during free play? Now, take a moment and think about this. We've got three conditions here. We've got students who had an expected reward, or award. You are going to earn this marker if you do this task. There is an extrinsic motivation to do this. There's an unexpected reward. There is kind of an award where you just got it, but you didn't know you were going to get it. And then there's our control condition, no award. So what they looked at was how long these students during free time played with the pens. And we see in the no award condition, our control condition, students spent about 18% of the time using this. So, maybe 20 minutes during an hour playtime, give or take. Maybe more like 15, whatever. I can't do math. But in the unexpected award condition, we see just about the same. That those kids who didn't expect to get a pen really thought they were going to, really ended up playing more with them and enjoyed them more. But in the expected award condition, we see a huge decrease because these students had earned, the pen. The other students earned the pen, but it wasn't an explicit thing. So one of the things might be related to what are the expected rewards of something. So if I teach and I get the expected reward of having a good class, having a lot of discussion, having students who enjoy the class, that's something that I'm going to get a lot of happiness out of for my own sake. But I'm getting paid to do this too, and it doesn't hurt to get paid for this. And what happens is that what we might think of is we might start to explain our rewards based on that extrinsic motivation. I like teaching, but now that I get paid for it, do I start to just think of it as a job? So why does this happen? It's what we call the over-justification effect, In the same way we might over or under-justify why we choose a partner, we might over-justify a behavior as being due to extrinsic reasons and underestimating intrinsic reasons, So if you earn that pen and you know you earned that pen, it's not really as cool to play with the pen because you're like, yeah, well, I mean, I earned it already, and it is what it is. But if you haven't earned it, or you don't expect to, maybe you have a different intrinsic reason to do this. So going back to self-perception and motivation, you all might remember, this is a little bit old for some of you, this Book It program, The Book It program was that for every X amount of books you read, that you get a personal pan pizza from Pizza Hut. They do similar things, I had reading counts in high school, middle school, where you earned a certain amount of points for each book you read. So think about it. What happens there? As somebody who's an avid reader, maybe I start to attribute my love for reading as my love to get these points and maybe, in this case, earn, mini pan pizzas. So maybe what happens is some of our intrinsic motivations start to become extrinsic. A great example is from Bill Russell, a basketball player. And he talks about how the game lost some magical qualities once they started playing it for a living. Whenever they walked on the court, they began to think about how that game might affect their future. Thoughts of money and prestige crept into my head. Over the years, the professional game would turn more and more into a business for him. Hopefully that doesn't happen to me because I really enjoy teaching and I don't want this to be something I only do for pay, So I have to think of other reasons, or I have to focus and not over-justify why I'm doing what I'm doing, Because there's always good and bad to any given job you do, and if you start justifying the bad based on money, that's something that might be happening. You may feel differently about the job over time. The last one we can talk about is our self-knowledge from other people, And when we talk about that, we can think about the fact that we exist outside of other people's perspectives. They form opinions about us. They also have, their beliefs about who we are. Think about me, for instance. I know for a fact you guys have the chance to rate how I teach and who I am and all of those things about me at the end of the semester. So I get to learn, actually, in a really effective way, some knowledge about me. I once had a student call me scatterbrained, which I don't disagree with, but I like to think I've made strides into not having a total scatterbrain. But, that is some self-knowledge I've gained from other people and what they've said about me. And so when we think about this, one way we can do this is through what we call the looking glass self. How other people perceive us, we can think of as a mirror for how we perceive ourselves. And what we can think about there is, what is it that we see people talking about with us and how we think that affects us. So if I walk into class and everybody treats me, right, good morning, Dr. Dickey, how are you? Right, thank you so much for doing this, blah, 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 blah. And what I can start seeing is, wow, maybe I am a respected member of the Stetson community in terms of, right, being a faculty member. I see that other people, right, are treating me a certain way, and that shows me kind of how maybe I'm being perceived to other people. I can look in the mirror and see what I'm projecting towards other people and how they're acting back. Another way we can do this is our what we can call reflected appraisals. This means our perception of how other people evaluate us. That is very different than, right, an actual evaluation. If I walk into class on day one and I have a great day teaching and I think the students like me, right, that's my perception. But what if I walk out of the room before everybody else and they go, I hate this class, look at this guy, right, he's terrible. That's different than the looking glass self. That's different than, right, what I actually am perceived as. It's what I think I'm perceived as, which isn't the same thing. We can also talk about things like direct feedback. This one's pretty obvious, right? The information that we receive from others about our traits and abilities, right? So Michael Phelps down here has a lot of direct feedback that he is a good swimmer. Right? If you earn good grades, you have direct feedback that you are, one, doing good in this class, and two, probably understanding these concepts well. And that helps you to know, hey, I seem to be good in this domain. That's not the only way we do this, and one of the most important ways that we can talk about is social comparison theory. And this comes back to Leon Festinger, who we talked about earlier. This is the guy who infiltrated the cult, right? So Leon Festinger is a really famous psychologist who did a lot of cool studies, and one thing that he looked at was how we learn about who we are by comparing ourselves to others, right? We are social creatures. To have one person around, we can't compare ourselves to anybody, but we know we have plenty of others around us. Just in the same way we can't understand the results of an experiment without a control condition, we can't understand ourselves without a reference group. So we learn about ourselves by looking at the similarities and differences between us and other people. So when do we do this? Well, we often do this when there's no clear objective standard and when we feel uncertain about about ourselves and who we are. So what we can think about here is the idea that when things are ambiguous, right? Am I a good person or right, am I doing well? Or, right, I'm not really, right, I don't feel like I'm doing well, or I'm not sure I'm a good person, and I can't find a good measuring stick to figure out if I am or not, right? Then we're going to start comparing ourselves to other people. And one thing we can ask is, who do we compare ourselves to? Well, like most things in social psychology, it depends. It depends on what we want to compare ourselves on in terms of our kind of outcome. So do we want to be accurate? If we want to compare ourselves in an accurate manner, say I want to compare myself to my peers, right? Am I a smart individual? What I can do is I can look at my grades and I can look at other people like me, look at similar others. But that's not always the only way we want to compare ourselves. We might want to compare ourselves to people who are better in kind of look in terms of an aspiration towards others, right? How other people are, right, doing better and we want to get there one day. Well, what we do is we call this upward social comparison, and we look at people we would consider better than us. So imagine that you are standing on a ladder, right? And you're somewhere in the middle. If we want to look upward, we're going to look at people who are higher up on that ladder in whatever dimension, right? Maybe more intelligent people, maybe people who are kinder, depending on whatever right, standard by which we're trying to compare ourselves on. But sometimes we don't want to just look at aspirations. Sometimes we don't feel so great, and sometimes we need a little bit of an ego boost. And when we need an ego boost, we can look downwards, a downward social comparison. One thing to note about this is we compare ourselves to others all the time, and depending on who we compare ourselves to, we can change the way we think. If I'm like, oh, I think I'm doing pretty well, and then I happen to walk by the 3 smartest kids in class, and I all of a sudden, right, I recognize the fact that, oh, I'm not that good, that's also, right, probably going to hurt my feelings a little bit. But in the same way, that downward social comparison, looking at, hey, at least I didn't fail, isn't a good way to get me motivated to do better. There's a lot of reasons we would use some of these over others. So as we said before, social comparisons are like a ladder, right? We can have an upward social comparison, comparing ourselves to someone who is better than us, right? Einstein, for instance. But the thing is, if we compare ourselves to the best, we might feel inferior, right? I think I'm smart, but I'm not Einstein, right? Well, I'm never going to be Einstein, right? He was a special breed. So I'm not that great. But what about when we compare somebody slightly better than us? Well, I got a B, but these people got an A. I bet I could do that. And that's going to give us motivation to improve and do better in the future. However, we can talk about downward social comparison and comparing ourselves to others who are worse than we are. If you ever watch, right, the Learning Channel, TLC, what a joke of a name, but this is full of things like My 600-Pound Life, right, hoarders, and these kind of people, right, tend to be worse off than you, right? I'm not saying that TLC is like, haha, look at how horrible these people are, but you can compare yourselves to them, and oftentimes you think, well, at least I'm not hoarding a bunch of stuff in my house. And what that does is it boosts our self-esteem, our well-being, and our happiness. But, unless you think you could experience the same misfortune, in which case you're going to say, I don't want to watch this. So which is better? Well, it depends. And one example of why it depends, think about this. For people who quit smoking, they tend to have far more success when they compare themselves to a slightly better other who has stopped smoking. Probably not a very better other, right? Somebody, for instance, I've never smoked in my life, so it doesn't make sense to compare to me, because that's a different standard, right? That's a completely different level. Because if I've never smoked, I've never had to quit. So we see that people who trying to quit smoking, when they have somebody like a mentor who's done this, who's within their reach, they believe they're going to do better. But breast cancer patients tend to fare far better when they compare themselves to patients who have it worse than them, right? Because you can think about some of that motivation or that positive well-being that's going to be like, okay, at least my body is doing this. I can still get out of this. And right, if you get too into that idea that you might experience that same terrible misfortune, that might hurt you. It might hurt your ability to do better or achieve a good downward social comparison. But we can also talk about, right, beyond our self-knowledge and self-comparison, similar to what we just talked about, how do we evaluate ourselves? On what criteria do we choose to evaluate ourselves? Well, one of the most important things to recognize is we have a positivity bias. We are motivated to view ourselves positively. We call this self-enhancement. However, there might be discrepancies in who we are, right? None of us are perfect. Well, none of you are perfect. I'm perfect. But the idea behind this is that we are all trying to strive to do better, generally. And we have to think, though. We have who we are. We know who we are generally. And I know there are certain things I like about me, and there are certain things maybe I don't. I don't go to the gym as nearly often as I should, right? I'm maybe a couple pounds heavier than I want to be, and that's just who I am. That's the real me. But there's also an ideal version of me, right? And this ideal version of me is different than the real me. The real self, who we actually are, is different than who we want to be. We can socially compare ourselves to, right, a better version of us, or possibly we can look to the past to imagine a worse version of us, right, and see who we were in the past. I like a quote I heard once that said, if you're cringing about who you were 5 years ago, you've grown as a person, right? You are downwardly social comparing and saying, at least I'm not that bad anymore. So this is this idea of, right, the real versus ideal versions of us, right? We know we're not perfect, and we're hopefully striving to be better. And sometimes that's easier than others to deal with, but what happens when things don't go our way? We want to view ourselves positively, but maybe things go south, right? Maybe you think you're a good, you're a good student, and you get a bad grade. Maybe you, just don't achieve the goals that you want to. Say you set a weight loss goal and you don't achieve it that week. Well, what are we going to do when we're not feeling so great, right? We can't view ourselves positively if we don't make our goals, right, completely. So we can do one of two things. We can talk about the self-affirmation theory, affirming who we are. And we can talk about the self-verification theory, looking for factual information to verify who we are. So are we affirming or verifying? With affirmation theory, affirming who we are going to talk about maintaining a sense of self-worth when we're confronted with information that lowers our view of ourselves, right? So say my goal is to lose 5 pounds a week, which is an absurd amount, but say I only lose 1 pound. Well, how am I going to maintain my self-worth when I'm confronted with this information that lowers my view of who I am? Usually what we do is we look for information in a different domain. So maybe I didn't make my weight loss goal this week, but, I can think about other things in which I'm good at, right? Well, I taught a really good lecture, or, I had a really nice day with my family, and I remember how great it is to be, a family man. And so what we can think about is that if we do bad at a task, you fail an exam, say, you still have self-worth, and you can affirm that in other ways. You can think back to, well, at least I've got friends who are really, who are there to support me, and there are grades are important, but there's other parts of me that still are good. So the self-affirmation theory is thinking about the other things that help affirm, we are still a person of worth. Whereas the self-verification theory is sometimes we look for what we call subjectively accurate beliefs about ourselves, not true beliefs. So we look for information that verifies or confirms what we believe. So this gives us a sense of coherence and predictability, even if it's false. So what happens if you do bad on an exam and you now are forced to come to the fact that, hey, maybe my self-worth in terms of running experiments, taking classes is not as good as I thought. Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought. Well, instead of looking for places that you are smart at, you might instead of looking for other domains you're good at, you might start looking for places that somebody is going to agree with you, right? So maybe you get a bad grade on your exam and you cry and you call your mom and go, Mom, am I smart? And your mom, because she loves you, is going to say, of course you're smart, honey. Don't worry about it. Well, you absolutely can be smart, but you weren't exactly good at that exam. And it's maybe important to recognize what you're good and not good at, right? Don't just wallow in the I'm terrible at this exam, but try to make a realistic expectation. Hey, I didn't do so good, right? I'm going to try to affirm who I am. I'm going to recognize that I'm smart in other areas too, but I'm not going to just give it and say, no, that doesn't mean anything, right? I'm going to say, I'm not going to say, well, I must, that test must just be terrible because it didn't show that I'm smart. So you've got to also recognize that the self-verification theory is going to be different than the self-affirmation theory. Moving on to impression management, how do we decide to present ourselves? This is a very important thing. Who I am, is to you is who I present myself as, right? The real me is probably different than the me who is teaching this course, right? I think I joked in a couple classes that oftentimes on Zoom, I maybe am, my lower half might be in gym shorts. Today, I will have I am in khakis, at home working. And so how we present ourselves is going to be a very important component of who we are. So we talk about impression management, or trying to get others to see us as we want to be seen, right? So this is a strategic control of information that we can communicate to others. This can be trivial information, or it can be important, right? It's all about what we are giving away, what we are telling people, right? I don't walk into class and present myself in a way that maybe makes me look like not a good professor, right? There are times in which I may be flustered, or I'm not as focused as I want to be, in the same way anyone is. But it's not useful for me to walk up on the first day of class and look like I don't know what I'm doing. Because think about what that's going to matter down the line. That's going to, have so many important understandings about how this class is going to work. If I look like I'm somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, think of it like this. If I was a middle school substitute teacher, you know those kids can smell blood in the water. If that substitute even shows a hint of weakness, kids just jump on it, man. Middle schoolers are the worst people, and I truly believe that. But the important thing to know is we are trying to get others to see us as we want to be seen. Maybe our ideal self, who we want to be, even though that's not exactly who we are, right? Think about people who post on Instagram a lot that maybe are presenting a view of themselves that isn't the real them. I saw a really funny video where these people were all in a limo and getting ready to party, and they had all their cameras going, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. And then 2 minutes later, they were all sitting there on their phones and nobody was chatting or partying at all. And that's a version of impression management right there. So how do we make and manage our impressions? Well, we can use what we call ingratiation. We can use praise to make ourselves seem likable, right? So we can use favors and flattery. We can use conformity. We can use strategic, true self-presentation. We can find ways that make us look good. One way that, a lot of professors end up accidentally using impression management is through Rate My Professor. If your Rate My Professor as a professor is high, students already have an impression of who you are. And if that impression is good, it completely colors and flavors the way that you think about that person and the rest of that class. So we can think about ways in which we can use praise or kind of positivity to see who we are. But we can also talk about self-handicapping, right? The idea of kind of knowing that there maybe are some things that aren't great, and maybe we actually kind of engage in those things so that way we don't look bad, right? So we might create obstacles or excuses, right? So that if we do poorly, we can avoid blame. Now, this comic, I think, is a great example of this, right? So somebody says, somebody's asking another friend, right, should we study for this? Or there's an exam on Friday. Are you studying? It says, nah, the night before is all I need. Bad idea in this class, just generally, just bad idea. This person, though, is thinking, what's the point? I'm going to fail anyway. And, they keep thinking that they're going to fail, but what they do is they keep self-handicapping and making excuses as to why they're going to do bad in the future, right? So the person here eventually gets a C-. They knew they could have studied, but they kept making excuses why not to. What we see, though, with this, and I think is really important, is there are valid excuses for people to not do good, right? I don't think I'm using the fact that my baby was born as a kind of self-handicapping mechanism, but I have been aware of that, right? I'm trying to get everything done, and there's a difference between talking about self-handicapping in a way that I'm like, oh, I'm going to go take care of my baby instead of working, versus, hey, there's a legitimate reason that I have been handicapped in terms of my ability to do things. I'm not doing it on purpose, right? But it does happen. So I think it's also important to recognize that. It's not the idea that self-handicapping just means that something bad happened and you're going to blame it on that. There's reasons something bad happens, and maybe that changes what you can do. But there's also this aspect that people who procrastinate oftentimes are just finding other things to do with their time, and that way they can say, oh, I just had too much time, or too much other stuff to do to avoid blame here. However, another thing to know is that some people actually manage their impressions much more than others. It's not the same for everyone, right? Some people are what we call high self-monitors. And so high self-monitors are the type of people who are what we maybe call social chameleons. They are people who, right, take an expended effort or a lot of effort to read other people in other situations. Now, this isn't Machiavellian or evil in any way, right? They're not just looking to exploit the scenario, but they are kind of looking for, right, how can I make a good impression? And there's times we want to, right? On a job search, if you are at a job interview, you probably want to pay a lot of attention to the impression you're giving. Versus there are other people who maybe are low in self-monitoring, and these people, right, we would consider to be more focused on, right, maybe just who they are, right? They are not really changing anything about themselves. So they're probably very honest and open, right? If you go to, right, your significant other's parents' house for dinner and they make food that isn't good, if you're a high self-monitor, you're probably going to go, oh, this is delicious, right? Even if you don't like it because you're trying to make a good impression. However, a low self-monitor might be like, it's fine, right? Giving you an honest opinion, but they're not really doing themselves any favors in the meantime. So recognizing that impression management is a huge portion of what we do, and a lot of it goes on in the background, but right, what we choose to wear, how we present ourselves, how we speak, how we act, those are all things that we can pay attention to and have a long-term impact. Right? We know first impressions are incredibly important. We know that they last for a long time, and making sure a good first impression comes out is something that you can do and know how to do well. The last couple things we're going to talk about are regarding self-esteem. So self-esteem, this idea, how do we protect who we are? And we kind of talked about this with self-verification and self-affirmation, but when we talk about what self-esteem is, this is our evaluation of our own self-worth. Are we worthy people? Right? Not necessarily am I worthy to go to college, am I worthy to do this, am I worthy to, right, enjoy life, but this idea of like, am I doing well, right? And what we can think about this is it comes in both trait and state measures. It also can be implicit, so internal. It can be explicit, what we say. There are implicit attitude tests, IATs, for self-esteem. So we can think about how, right, maybe if you know the IAT, which we'll talk about later, if you're pairing a lot of words about me with, right, negative things like bad, maybe we know that your self-esteem is a little lower, but we also have explicit measures, right? Just general scale measures, or, what do you think your self-esteem is? But what's very interesting about self-esteem is it relies on success and failure in important domains, right? So how do we measure our self-worth? Well, we measure it based on contingencies of self-worth in the important domains to us. For many of us, those are things like academics or our work. Some people value sports or fitness and health. We can also talk about social life and anything you find important, right? If you find, right, if you're an artist and you find many people listening to your music, something that's important to you, that's a contingency of self-worth. However, for me, right, health is an important part of my life, but it's not a huge one right now. If you ever go to grad school, you'll understand why. But the point of that is, right, it's important that I have these contingencies of self-worth, but some are more valuable to me than others, right? If I found out I was a terrible, terrible dad, and, right, my family life is incredibly important to me, that's going to hurt. But if I found out I wasn't as healthy as I thought I was, it's like, I kind of knew it already, and, I got to work on it. It's not great, but it's not going to be devastating, right? If all you care about is school and you get a D in a class, it's going to be devastating to you. But if you care about, right, academics, in addition to things like sports and your social life, that D is going to hurt, but it's going to hurt, that grade is going to hurt, but it's going to hurt less and for a shorter amount of time, as long as we're still doing well in other domains. Almost think about it like you can think about this like the house in Up, right? This is going to be something where maybe if you don't do the best on everything, right, if you lose one balloon here, you still got enough balloons to lift you up. But if it's the only balloon you have, right, it's not going to go well. And when we think about this, we talk about self-complexity. So the more domains, right, or more balloons in which we base our self-worth or to lift ourselves up, the more resilient your self-esteem will be in the future. Think about it this way. If you put all your eggs in one basket and you lose the basket, you're going to lose everything. But if you have 3 different baskets, each with an egg, it's going to be different. This is a very functional and protective mechanism for us, right? It's oftentimes why it's not good to only look at yourself in one domain. We are multifaceted, multi-layered people. We have many different domains in which we can look at, and recognizing that is very important. Most of us have high self-esteem, right? Relatively. Right? So what are the consequences of high self-esteem? Well, one thing is terror management theory. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the semester, but terror management theory is the idea that we know at some point we're going to die, right? We have a mortality, but if we have high self-esteem, we don't really think about it too much. We kind of put it away and we say, not today, death. We don't want to think about you today. And when you have lower self-esteem, it's actually pretty negative towards that. Self-esteem is related to self-evaluation and kind of self-enhancement. So making us overly optimistic about our failures, right? We tend to try harder, we persevere over failure, and we set higher goals even if we don't do well. I didn't do well on this exam, but I'm going to study even harder, and I'm going to do better on the next one. One thing I often get asked about is narcissism, though. Narcissism, right, involves extreme high self-esteem, right? These people believe they are great at everything. They are wonderful. But the difference between narcissism and high self-esteem is that individuals with narcissism tend to lack empathy towards others. I can be incredibly proud of who I am, and I can also not be a narcissist. So recognizing how that works. Beyond self-esteem, and part of self-esteem, I would say, is what we call self-efficacy. And our book doesn't talk about this, but I think it's an incredibly important concept. Self-efficacy is our confidence in our ability to accomplish and succeed in tasks. Not just our self-worth. Are we worth doing things, but can we do the things we need to do? And we can talk about different domains, right? Right? We can talk about our performance experience. Have I done well in the past? Am I going to continue to do well? We can talk about vicarious experience, right? Observed experiences or modeling by others. If we are watching how others behave, do we think, yeah, I could probably do that? We can talk about social persuasion. So do people around us give us feedback that says, yeah, you can go do it, right? Or are they saying, no, you couldn't do that? Talk about imaginal experiences. So are you somebody who can visualize the fact that you're going to succeed? Or as we know, for instance, depressed individuals tend to do, they tend to not be as positive. They tend to think they can't do these things. Do you have low self-efficacy in your ability to think that you are able to achieve these even in your own mind? And lastly, physical and emotional states we know really do matter. So some days you come home and you're just like, I am so done. I can't do anything right. This is horrible. Right? Sometimes you're physically exhausted, and right, you might know, like, I literally am unable to lift, right, another set of reps because I am physically exhausted. So what's the difference between self-esteem and self-efficacy then? Well, we know that self-esteem is a stable and universal thing. This is more of a trait. But self-efficacy is transient, and it's specific to different domains. We tend to have higher self-esteem in the fact that we generally are people of worth. But there are certain things I know I'm good at, right? And there are certain things I know maybe I'm not good at. A domain-specific thing that I am not good at is I am not a great cook. My wife and I have been together for over 10 years, and she is a fantastic cook. I can cook, I'm just not good at it because I never really ended up practicing all that much. But does that mean my self-esteem for who I am is in the toilet? No, right? I know I'm good at other things. I used to be a lot better at video games than I am now. Apparently my hand-eye coordination is going, but right, that is something I know I have much more ability or efficacy in my ability to do. And both of these together are part of who we consider our self-concept to be. One last thing that I want to spend some time talking about is this idea of self-control. And self-control, right, we can think back to Michel's experiment where he had marshmallows in front of students or young kids, and how long those kids would hold off before eating that marshmallow. And one way we can think of self-control is just this ability to control our impulses or control ourselves in our pursuit of our goals, right? Probably you don't love coming to class every day for every class you go to. My class, I understand, is totally different and everybody loves it. But, right, you still go to class. You put in that energy, you come to class, you ask questions, you do what you need to. And so we can think of self-control as kind of doing what we need to be doing, even if we don't want to do it. One way we can think about this is what we call the self-regulatory resource model. So it's self-regulating, and it's a model of resources, and what we mean is it's a renewable but small and limited resource. So many people can think of a time where their patience has run thin because other things are going on, right? If you're incredibly stressed, you are very tired, maybe you worked out or were busy moving and lifting heavy things, or you spent too much time trying to be very, very focused. Like when you walk out of an exam, for instance, where you have to really focus in, you might, run out of your self-control eventually. So oftentimes, right after an exam, you might get kind of a little bit glassy-eyed and you realize that maybe you're more likely to snap at your significant other, or maybe you just say, I don't want to eat well tonight, I need some kind of fatty foods or comfort food because it was a really long day. And what that is known as is ego depletion. And ego depletion is a state that occurs when our self-control resources have been totally used up, right? So after a long day where we had to really focus and spend a lot of energy on our self-control, this kind of muscle that we are using, right? It's harder to exert self-control, and it makes it easier to make mistakes. So, for instance, maybe our self-control is kind of run thin. What we see happens is that a lot of these things, is that when this resource is used up, it's got to replenish itself. And one thing to recognize is that, as I mentioned before, this model we're talking about often thinks of this like a muscle, so that the more control you exert, the more strength you get at controlling it, right? Not necessarily right away. In the same way that just because I lifted weights doesn't mean I can go lift heavier weights immediately. It means that as I keep doing this and keep practicing it, over time it becomes a stronger muscle. Again, self-control is not a muscle, but it is some kind of way that we are exerting this resource in our head. One way we can replenish this, in the same way you might take, I know chocolate milk is something great to drink after a workout, is that you can replenish this naturally by resting. And there's some mixed evidence to say that going outside and being in nature helps this, and also glucose or sugar helps this to replenish. Think about during your day, if it's 2 p.m. and you're having the 2 p.m. blahs, or you're like, oh, I'm really tired today. If you have a Snickers or you have something with maybe some sugar in it, it helps you kind of re-engage and get back to what you're doing. Especially if, say, you're typing a paper that's taking a lot of your self-control. Maybe you go take a break, take a quick walk around, eat something that's a little bit sugary, right? Don't just take some Splenda packets and chug them. This might help you a little bit to refocus and get back on track. And as we mentioned, this can be built up in the long term like a muscle. And so self-regulation is this idea that we are able to regulate this process of self-control. Baumeister is a name that, if you're in social psychology, is a very, very famous social psychologist. He came up with the paper that the need to belong is a fundamental human need. He's also in Florida. I believe he's at the UCF or he might be at University of Miami. But generally, he is considered one of the biggest names in the field. I've had the pleasure of meeting him once, and he gave a really interesting talk on what it means to have our ability to regulate who we are. And one of the studies that he did was he had people come into a room and do some taste testing. So he said, all right, anybody who signs up for this experiment, you're going to come in and you're going to take this experiment. What you're going to be doing is you are going to be taste testing some item. And what he did was he had the room smell like fresh baked cookies. So think about this. If a room smells like fresh baked cookies, that's going to be something you're like, oh, I really like cookies. Most of us really like cookies. That's good. But what happens is people either ate radishes, cookies, or nothing. So radishes, cookies, or nothing. Not in that order. Which of these do you think is going to be easiest to have self-control for? If you're smelling these delicious cookies and you have to eat radishes, is that going to help you eat these radishes? Probably not. If you're in the control condition and you smell fresh cookies, if you're kind of hungry, that's not going to be useful because you've got to kind of avoid thinking about how hungry you are. But if the cookies that you're eating smell like the cookies that you're smelling, this isn't a self-control task, right? It's just eat the cookies. So afterwards, after this taste test, they had individuals complete an impossible puzzle. So a puzzle, you're kind of puzzle with your puzzle pieces, but either pieces were missing or they all didn't fit you couldn't make a picture. And what happened, and what our dependent variable was how long do these people spend on these puzzles? So if this puzzle, is really difficult, think about self-control. Maybe you can think about it in one way as being like patience, right? So if you've eaten fresh baked cookies in a room smelling like fresh baked cookies, and you haven't really exerted self-control, so you're probably more patient. You're more likely to spend more time on this. And in fact, individuals in the cookies condition spend about 19 minutes on average trying to complete this puzzle. Now, if you're eating radishes, it's going to take so much self-control to continue to eat these radishes and resist that cookie smell, that your self-control resources are going to be used up, or you're going to lose some of them, right? You've spent time already working out your self-control muscles, and now you're a little bit tired. And now we see these individuals only lasted about 8 minutes, right? Really, really low. What's interesting is that in the control condition, where they didn't have anything, they again smelled these things, but we had no significant difference from our cookies condition, because they weren't using up this self-control muscle trying to eat these radishes instead of cookies. They just were dealing with the fact that this room smelled like cookies. Some other things that we can do to decrease somebody, or kind of what's the word I want to use here? What are some other ways that we can look at self-regulation and self-control? Some other dependent variables are those kind of don't laugh during this funny film, right? We can talk about physical stamina. How long can you hold a button that maybe is hard to press? We can talk about other things like eating habits of dieters. So if you are dieting, it's probably taking up a lot of your self-control, right? And so a lot of these things, it's not just whether or not you can eat cookies or not, or eat marshmallows, but again, self-control is all around us. How long can you stand being in a room with, the uncle you hate over Thanksgiving before you have to walk out, before you lose your tongue, right? How much self-control can you keep handling there? So one last thing, just the quick reminder that our announcements, please keep up with the materials. Make sure you're reading both the book and the reading both the book and you're watching the videos, make sure you recognize that there are some papers coming up soon-ish, not necessarily right away, but keep that in mind. And if you have any questions, email me or stop by office hours. Would love to talk to you guys. Happy to chat about anything you're interested in regarding this. And if you do need anything from me, please shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a great weekend or week, whatever it is, and I will see you soon, hopefully.